Dr. Aguirre.
Thank you, Ma'am Ched. Thank you for the introduction. Yung isang student mo pala dito is a graduate of Broadcom.
Sino siya?
Si Maria Luisio. Okay, just
Hello po. Ako po yan. Hello
Akala ko
po.
sa archaeology ka, Marie.
Ay, undergrad ko po, Teacher Ched, ay Broadcom.
Broadcom.
Kaya iniikot ko po yung mga colleges dito sa Diliman.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Nice. Also, thank you, Ma'am Ched. So you will probably, if you listen to Ma'am Ched's introduction of me, you'll probably notice the kind of, how would you say it, the maybe the academic migration that I did from communication research to Philippine studies, basically arts and letters, and then to a more discursive kind of um, um, training. So that particular background actually is centered around the idea of making sense of texts and experiences. And that's basically what discourse analysis in general is all about. And the theory of discourse. While I look for my my slide, sorry. The entire theory of discourse is that I hope you can see my screen.
Yes,
Kita ba yung
sir.
screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Opo.
good. Thank you.
Kita.
So let me just go full screen mode. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So basically, what as I was saying, yung background kong yon actually led me to the whole idea of discourse, and particularly about the main premise of discourse theory that while our reality is not really just all about discourse, it's not just all about language, it's not all about science, semiotics, and meanings. Every aspect of our human social cultural experience would have a discursive part in it. And that is where critical discourse analysis as a particular analytic endeavor would be able to help us to unravel and to make us see the significance of and the ramifications and implications of the discursive aspects of any experience that we have in the world. So you can see my title here is Critical Discourse Studies as opposed to Critical Discourse Analysis, and I will be explaining later why there is such a change in the title or in the label. Critical Discourse Analysis, or CDA, is still being used, and for by any means you could still use it, but quite recently, maybe around 10 years ago or 8 to 10 years ago, there has been a shift within the critical discourse analysis field where practitioners actually had to rethink of critical discourse analysis, not just as a particular analytic approach to studying certain discursive artifacts or to studying speech and writing, but it is an entire school of thought that is composed of many different approaches. And that is why, to enlarge and to make it more encompassing, the label critical discourse analysis or the name critical discourse studies is now increasingly becoming more common in the academic field, within the academic field, and in interdisciplinary circles. So I would tend to use critical discourse studies to refer specifically to the idea that this is a particular school of thought, that this is a particular research interest, this is a particular area of academic endeavor that is eclectically defined. It's defined by so many different approaches from many different fields. And while the historical origin of critical discourse studies would be linguistic in its feature, there has been a lot of change already that's happening within the field itself, and I probably will be able to tackle some of them today. But what I will be able to tackle today is and that is why my subtitle is a very short introduction to critical discourse studies, because it is impossible to do it in maybe 1 hour or 1.5 hours. I'll try to make it short, but I will try to also give you the overview of critical discourse studies. And if you are interested in, in some form, if you become interested, then we could talk more about the specificities of certain details of the critical discourse studies field. My objectives for tonight are, they're simple. One is to be able to explain and for us to understand the philosophical premise of critical discourse studies. And two, to become familiar with the different CDS approaches. I won't be able to tackle all the approaches in detail, like I said, but I will be presenting to you the different approaches that are under the label critical discourse studies. They will have certain intersections. They will have certain similarities, but of course, because they are different approaches, they are attacking or they are tackling the notion of discourse and discourse theory from a particular angle, and that is why they tend to focus on some things. One approach will focus on some things. Other approaches will focus on other things that comprise the entire notion of discourse. But I will be able to dwell a bit more time and give a bit more time on a fairly common and very basic, but foundational and very important discourse analytic approach. And this is Norman Fairclough's three-dimensional discourse model approach. And you are probably familiar with this if you have been reading about this critical discourse analysis, if you have done critical discourse analysis in the past. This is one of the basic models, one of the basic approaches to critical discourse analysis. And third, we will attempt, if there is time left in the session today, we will attempt to apply the main concepts and the main arguments of Fairclough in this model in creating a sample and analyzing that particular sample using this particular approach. So these are the three objectives for tonight, and I hope that we have the time to sufficiently discuss each one of them. I will start with the basic question of what is the philosophy and politics of CDA or CDS. Okay, I always start my introduction to critical discourse studies with this quotation from Michel Foucault, and Foucault is one of the main thinkers behind the whole notion of discourse. And while critical discourse analysis is not exactly the same as a Foucauldian kind of discourse analysis, they would have their intersections because critical discourse analysis, or some approaches to discourse, critical discourse analysis at least, are underpinned by or undergirded by a Foucauldian theorization of discourse. So I will be quoting from his work, Discipline and Punish, and you probably are familiar with this. There is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power relations. There are three things that are important in this quotation, three things that are fundamental if we are to study the entire idea of discourse theory. Okay, one is it is all about power, and we are always embedded in relations of power, and there is no escaping that particular kind of situation. The only problem is most of the time, a lot of us would not be privy to how this power relationship works and will not actually be conscious enough of thinking how certain structures in society make certain things harder for certain people or certain groups, and while others actually benefit from that particular structure. So there is a relationship of power that we are, unfortunately, that we'd have to contend with all the time, but we'd have to see them, and we'd have to be conscious and aware of them for us to be able to tackle them. There are moments when they are more apparent, like for example, when we feel like there is a literal abuse that we've witnessed, that is a particular kind of physical literal imbalance in power, for example. When we speak of the political arena, um, power is quite obvious there. But in everyday life, there are lots of situations where we chose not to, or we are trained not to see the imbalance in power relations. And if we are talking about discourse, the argument is the discursive aspects of our reality is an index of these kinds of relationships or relationships of power that we had that we need to address and that we need to see and that we need to tackle. So power is one of the things that are important here in this particular quotation, but also um, uh, this quotation mentions the term field of knowledge, right? And in a Foucauldian sense, from a Foucauldian perspective, knowledge is tantamount to power, which means that if you have the control over producing knowledge of whatever in the world, then you tend to have the power or the a particular hold in how reality will be understood and accepted by society or by people. So when when government, for example, uh, would take our data in their censuses, for example, then they would have knowledge of what a particular population is like, so that they will have the means to and the basis for um, constructing policies that will put this population under control, and that is what Foucault meant by again the biophysics of power. So knowledge of any form will give you an advantage, and if you have control over that production of knowledge, then you certainly will have control over that, over how things should be seen and how things should be organized in society. And the third aspect of this quotation is that um, uh, knowledge and power go hand in hand. And the inescapability of knowledge and power in our daily lives is a reality that we would have to be aware of. Because knowledge here is not literal knowledge, like formal education kind of knowledge. Knowledge here would probably pertain to information. Knowledge here would also cover the kinds of social media activities that we have, because we basically exchange information over social media. And the notion of algorithm is a good example of how this quotation is still true up to now. Okay, so this particular quotation is basic in understanding discourse analysis. But if we are to define what discourse is, because we are talking about the entire theory of discourse, then we need to have a particular kind of conceptual demarcation or conceptual definition of what discourse is. There's a lot of ways of defining discourse, but I find that G's definition is encompassing. I also find it, though it's kind of longish, it has the ability to make us see the different aspects of discourse, at least as it is used in critical discourse analysis as a particular analytic approach, or critical discourse studies as a particular school of thought or area of interest. So let's start with the first part of G's definition. Discourses are characteristic. I'm highlighting certain terms here that are key in understanding the whole idea of discourse. Discourses are characteristic ways of talking and writing about, as well as acting with and toward people and things. So I highlighted socially and culturally and historically formed, because discourse should be contextually defined. The whole experience and idea of discourse is that it is contingent on a particular context, and that context is social and cultural and historical. So our use of words, for example, the images that we circulate over whatever form of media, these are all significant, but they are significant in a particular context, and the context should be social, cultural, and historical. because in other contexts, they would have a particular significance that might be different from the current context that we have. Certain images are repeated over time, but they would have a different meaning because the context of their use is different from when they were used before compared to when they are used now. So socially, culturally, historically, this changing context of discourses, and this should be one of the things that we should always remember. If we are to understand, discourses, then we'd have to put it in a proper context. And these are characteristic ways of talking and writing traditionally, because discourse analysis or critical discourse analysis, has traditionally been interested in speech and writing, so in talk and text. So mainly, and in reality, that's the kind of experience that we have if we are to talk about discursivities. It is a communicative practice. It is a way of exchanging information. It is a way of circulating ideas. It is a way of cementing certain beliefs about certain things in the world. And we do this by interacting and communicating with people. It is about talking or writing in its liberal sense, okay? But also it is behaving towards others, and not just other people, but also other things, but also other realities in the world. Again, as I said a while ago, while our reality is not just about discourse, every aspect of our reality would have a discursive component to it. So what this means is that even if discourse cannot fully capture all aspects of our reality, discourse has a significant role to play in that construction and acceptance of certain aspects of reality. So critical discourse studies or critical discourse analysis um, what it's attempting to do is to understand these discursive formations that are part of our everyday diverse experience. Next part of the definition is these ways, the talking and writing and the acting, these ways are circulated and sustained within various texts, artifacts, images, social practices, and institutions, as well as in moment-to-moment social interactions. So there is circulation and continuous production. There is a pattern reproduction and consumption of certain information. And we consume and produce information via certain apparatuses. And these are texts, these are artifacts, images, social practices, institutions. They are probably not just about talking or writing, but just the same, they use language, again, in its liberal sense. Maybe it is verbal language, maybe it is visual language, maybe it is oral language, but certainly these are apparatuses or tools or techniques that we use in order to exchange information. So critical discourse studies is also aware of the multiplicity of these apparatuses. And more recently, there is a move within the critical discourse studies field to focus more on these aspects of discourse, aside from the linguistic aspect that it has traditionally focused on. Okay, the last part. In turn, they cause certain perspectives and states of affairs to come to seem or be taken as normal or natural, okay, and others to seem or be taken as deviant or marginal. For example, what counts as a normal prisoner, that is Foucauldian, discipline punish, hospital patient or student, or a normal prison, hospital or school at a given time and place. Again, context at a given time and place. So this third section of the definition is focused more on the effects or the implications of discourse. The continuous and repeated pattern circulation of certain ideas, they have the tendency to cement and make certain beliefs more real and more permanent than others. And in that sense, it makes certain things seem like they're normal or natural, not because they are naturally normal, but because they are long-standing. And that kind of long-standing understanding and definition of reality is maintained by our discursive engagement. we talk about them, we read about them, we watch them on media, we listen to certain people says how what people say about things. We listen to songs that probably normalize certain beliefs. So these are the effects of discourse, and our engagement with discourse in our everyday lives would occasion a particular kind of concretizing certain beliefs and certain ideologies. That is why, in critical discourse analysis, the whole idea of it being about power is actually the entry point. We are premised, or the field is premised, on the idea that all these things are are based on, or are founded on, um, the the effort at maintaining or sustaining certain normalized or naturalized ways of thinking about things, of thinking about the world, even if they are contingent on certain contexts, even if they are liable, or they are they could change, because certain sectors would benefit from certain systems to be maintained. There is also the effort for these elite forces, or for these ruling or dominant forces, to try to temper our resistance to these kinds of dominant ideologies. And how do they do it? They do it discursively most of the time, right? They talk to you, they use words, they use visuals in order for them to convince people that certain things would have to be done in a certain way. You can see this during the elections. We just witnessed, for those of you who were interested, we just witnessed how the U.S. elections had come along, and we know that that is like a, a massive example of how discourse plays out in the political world. So it's all about an exchange of words. It's all about exchange of images. And we finally see who actually was dominant and which ideas were dominant. So um, the discursivity of our experience might not be able to define the entirety of our experience. And again, I always say this. I've been saying this from the beginning, because this is one of the questions um, you know um, um, thrown against critical discourse analysis. Why are you focused on discourse? Why are you focused on talking and writing, or language, for example? Why are you focused on meaning, when the human experience is more than that? Well, that is true, right? But you will not be able to go through one day without having a discursive experience. And for the most part, that discursive experience would be based on a particular belief or ideology. And that discursive experience would probably affect the way you think, and the way you behave, and the way you make decisions for that particular day. So there is still that particular importance or necessity for us to dwell on the entire idea of discourse, or the discursivity. Or, if you'd like to be more traditional about it, the wordiness of our world, the wordiness of our existence. Words meaning, even if we say that words do not, compose the entire human experience, words would have a significant role to play in, the apprehension and creation of our experience. So, in if we go back to his definition of discourse, you will notice here how in critical discourse studies, we do not only, while we are, while it is based on speech and writing, on language, basically it has already evolved in so many different ways. But the important thing here is that there is the assumption that certain ideas are circulated, sustained, and reinforced via different apparatuses, and these apparatuses would have the potential to normalize and naturalize certain beliefs. And that is why we have to, as critical discourse analysts, be aware of this particular role that we play, not in unraveling the truth about society, but in making a case for perhaps thinking more deeply and more complexly about the everyday mundane ways of experiencing discursive situations, of engaging in discursive situations. Okay, so Vodak and Meyer actually they synthesize the whole idea of critical discourse analysis versus discourse analysis. And the main differences are here. Okay, one, in critical discourse analysis, there is an interest in naturally occurring language used by real language users. Critical discourse analysis and discourse analysis are two of those approaches that are quite significant in education research. Critical discourse analysis has been a staple approach in the field of education because mainly education is a discursive affair, right? It's all about exchange of information. It's all about a particular use of language to convey information and to process information. So it's not surprising how critical discourse analysis or discourse analysis in general would be quite familiar for those of you who are in the education field. Okay, but our interest in critical discourse analysis is in naturally occurring language, as opposed to the ideal forms of language. If you go back to the Saussure's notion of the lang and parole, right? Lang being the systems, the structures of language, and parole being the everyday use of language. Critical discourse analysis is more interested in the parole aspect of language. Okay. Second, there is a focus on larger units than isolated words and sentences. In critical discourse analysis, we are not concerned about specific words, specific use of words, but it's all about the entirety, the wholeness of certain discursive situations or discursive cases. So we tend to look for coherence. We tend to look for the interconnections of these particular use of words, and not just focused on isolated words or sentences. In the actual analysis, we probably would have to pick out certain words or sentences to exemplify certain arguments, but they would have to be placed in the context of the larger unit. Third, there is an extension of linguistics beyond sentence grammar. We are not, while grammar is an important indicator of certain arguments, grammar is not the only thing that is important in language when we are dealing with critical discourse analysis. Okay. The extension to nonverbal or semiotic multimodal visual aspects is certainly, one of the things that are being done today in critical discourse studies. A focus on dynamic socio-cognitive or interactional moves or strategies, meaning this is all about an exchange. This is all about interaction. So when we, for example, analyze a text, we don't see the text as as an artifact existing in a vacuum or existing on its own. We see the text as a product of interaction, as a product of certain conflicts, as a product of long-standing practices between individuals, between traditions, between beliefs. Okay. Next is there is a focus on context of language use, like what I've said, and the first part of G's definition of discourse is that it should be historically, culturally, and socially located. Language use, at least in social linguistics, is always understood as a situated kind of practice. So in critical discourse analysis, it's no different. Our analysis of language should be contextualized all the time. And lastly, an analysis of a vast number of phenomena of text and grammar and language use. This simply means that we do not only study one text if we are doing critical discourse analysis. That's what you do with literary analysis, right? You study one novel, you study one poem, you study one short story, and that is fine for literary criticism because the goal is different. But for critical discourse analysis or critical discourse studies, you'd have to have a set of data, a data set that would give you an idea of the pattern practices. The reason why we cannot dwell on just one case alone or one text alone is that we won't be able to establish a pattern of discursive practice. And the point of critical discourse analysis is to show that these are patterned ways or long-standing ways of doing things in discourse, which means that you'd have to base it on a set of data. right? And for example, if you are doing, discourses of agency and power in and in political news, for example, you can't just base your analysis on one news story and say that this is how power and agency is constructed in political news. You'd have to establish that this is a pattern of discursive practice that could be seen in different instances where they are used. So that means you'd have to look for a sound and substantial set of data. And so we analyze a vast number of phenomena. Um, it all depends, if you are to ask me, so how much data should we have? It all depends on the objective of your study. But what is certain is that you can't just have one, okay, sample of a text for to be able to establish that a practice of a discursive practice is existent in this particular context. So after the introduction, okay, now we are ready to talk about the philosophical premise of CDA. So we have the main epistemological assumptions of CDA, and we have largely we have talked about how to define CDA. Now we dwell on the philosophical premise of CDA or CDS because it is, it is important for us to establish that we actually believe these philosophical premises before we could do critical discourse analysis in our studies. Because if you don't believe this philosophical premise, then there is no point actually applying or doing critical discourse analysis. Number one, there is an awareness of seen and unseen structures of power in discursive and communicative events. Meaning, like I said, in the beginning, it is all about power. And the entry point is that, society is defined by an uneven relation of power. So there is an unseen or seen structures of power in our discursive engagements. Okay. Number two, CDA or CDS is hermeneutic reconstructive. It is interpretive work. It is all about making meanings out of certain practices or out of certain materials or text. Number three, it is critical, dialectical, theoretical, which means that there is an agenda in CDA or CDS about enlightenment, and that particular enlightenment is making people see that from a Marxist perspective, making people see that their lives are not the only way to live, and that there is a particular social order that is maintained because certain sectors benefit from it. So that particular kind of very Marxist approach is one of the philosophical premises of CDA. Okay. Just to make everything clearer, if we say hermeneutic reconstructive, we are talking here about how we commonly make sense of the world, how we usually make certain experiences sensible. The hermeneutic reconstructive theory as a philosophical premise of CDA means that our everyday experience is all about understanding this particular kind of existence, and that is what CDA or CDS is also trying to do. It is trying to make sense of this world by going deeply into the data set and trying to make us see that there are certain ways of interpreting or reading or making sense of these discursive instances that are not usually transparent. So what we do in CDS or CDA is actually what we do in our everyday lives. It's trying to make sense of that particular reality and our embedment in the social cultural world. So there is no difference. It's just that when you are practicing CDA, you are more intent, you are more focused on a particular objective, so that you see ways of reading particular texts or particular discursive instances that are not usually practiced by on a regular day, because people won't have that particular time or won't have the same time or energy as you will have if you are a critical discourse analyst. But The point is, it's still meaning making, and every one of us um, is actually capable of making sense or making meanings out of our experiences, out of our discursive, engagements. It's just that if you are a critical discourse analyst, then you have a particular agenda that you try to follow and fulfill. Okay. The second, the third philosophical premise of CDA is that it is critical dialectical and theoretical, which means that it's about, enlightenment, about and making people see the historical and social situation. And this particular kind of instructiveness, this particular kind of noble and very profound agenda is something that is a burden to critical discourse analysts. If you are, approaching the world via critical discourse analysis, then there is that constant burden on you to resolve a lot of issues because the world is problem plagued, right? We have a lot of issues that we need to resolve, and critical discourse analysis is actually, is based on that particular kind of profound agenda that we should find solutions to our problems of inequality, problems of abuse, problems of disenfranchisement. So these are the things that critical discourse analysis is concerned about. So when we try to select our research topic or research interest, when we try to do a research on a particular set of people or community or group, our primary goal is toward emancipation. So this kind of critical perspective, this kind of dialectical point of view, where we see that society is composed of a conflict and a struggle between different forces. This is what critical discourse analysis is all about. So there is a profound objective toward emancipation in critical discourse analysis. But this is not to say that we will be able to solve all the world's problems because we are doing one critical discourse analytic project. It's just that our goal is towards that resolution of the problems. So there is that critical engagement, and there is that political commitment. So that is why I preface this particular section by saying that if you are not a believer in this particular philosophy, then probably critical discourse analysis is not for you, because critical discourse analysis is a whole political stance. It's an entire political commitment, and it's not just an academic endeavor per se. So maraming hinihingi ang critical discourse analysis if you think about it. So if we are not prepared to be engaged in this kind of critical commitment towards societal emancipation, then it will be very hard for you to do critical discourse analysis. Okay. Theoretically, the roots of CDA could be traced back to a publication by Norman Fairclough. The label itself, critical discourse analysis, was introduced by Norman Fairclough, and this publication, Critical Discourse Analysis, the critical study of language. It is primarily social linguistic. It is critical linguistics in its academic foundation. Theoretically, it is an adherent of Marxism, ideology, the notions of ideology, Gramscian hegemony. So those kinds of global analysis of power and imbalance of power relations. So there is also an adherence to a Foucauldian kind of discourse analysis. Basically, the notion of discursive formation, the notion of power and knowledge, etc., etc. But it is also, at least in the beginning, it is all about critical linguistics. It is linguistic based, and there is no denying that. And from Fowler and Chris, we will understand how critical discourse analysis would, at least in its origin, was heavily attached to social linguistics or critical linguistics, because of the argument that linguistic meaning is inseparable from ideology. So this is a strong contention. The argument is every kind or any kind of language use, any kind of situated language use cannot be extracted from ideology. So there would always be that particular struggle for power if we are talking about language. But CDA as a label, specifically was introduced by Fairclough in 1995 via this publication. Okay, critical discourse analysis, the critical study of language. This is an important background information because we will be dealing with how it has evolved over the years and currently what it looks like. Okay. So before I move on to my next set of slides, are there any questions or clarifications so far?
So
in terms of the basic definition and philosophical foundation of critical discourse analysis. Yes, Ma'am Ched?
So sir, Alwin, so parang itong framework na to can be used in studying, for example, classroom observation.
Yes.
And
actually,
also,
a lot of CDA actually deals with classroom setting, sa educational setting. Yeah.
And a lot of us will be doing that.
Yes. And CDA, you will be surprised if you look into the literature that uses CDA. Ang dami niyan education setting. Kasi nga, ang premise nito, knowledge formation, right? So, and where else could you more immediately see how knowledge is formed and exchanged, but in the education setting? So, maraming, it's a staple actually in the education research area, CDA.
Yeah,
so, and it's not surprising.
Ang isa rin na inaaral namin usually is yung policy,
Educational
policies.
Yeah.
Yun yung mga yan. Okay,
and policies are actually discursively formed. You cannot have a policy without the use of language. Kaya yung sinasabi natin, like, even if our experience is not entirely built on language or composed of language, a lot of our experiences would have a discursive or linguistic aspect to it. Policies, for example. How do you create and communicate policy? How do you implement policy? It is by using language, right? And you will notice how certain linguistic devices are used in policymaking and how these particular ways of making policy would actually, attempt to construct a particular reality about what they're trying to do, right? So in education policy, how is language used, for example? In the more recent, happening in the education sector where the mother tongue based education was, just, scrapped. Tama ba, Ma'am Ched? Because I remember you talking about. But how did they discursively actually construct that particular kind of revision in the policy, and what justification devices did they use? So that's an interesting point to study, for example, in that particular case.
Okay. And then finally, pwede rin na, kunyari, syempre, if we do classroom observation, but there are things that are not quote-unquote heard. Kunyari, yung curriculum, yung gumawa ng curriculum, but they are there, diba?
Yes, always.
Nandun sila sa classroom.
Exactly, always.
So pwede rin. Okay, sige.
Yes. That's why if you go back to G's definition, it's like everything that is, part of our experience is part of, could be, taken as part of the discursive project, the discourse analysis project, the talk that happens in class, the texts that are, circulated in class, and, certain other aspects, the interaction of, the teacher and the student, the interaction of students amongst themselves, even yung the words plastered on the walls of the classroom, right? And the images plastered on the walls of the classroom. I remember it was Sara Duterte, diba, who said that, classroom should be just plain white or something like that. May ganon, diba? Siya sinabi, so, students could concentrate or something. So that is a, particular way of constructing the reality of the classroom. And, and it is a discursive approach to constructing the reality in the classroom. It's the emptiness of certain signifiers, right? And it's basically a discursive situation on its own.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ma'am Ched. So if you don't have other comments or questions, I'll proceed to this particular slide. So some approaches to CDA. Again, I will not be able to dwell on each one of them, but if you have questions, maybe we could tackle, some of the interesting aspects or the basic aspects of it. Number one, discourse. These are the more common ones. Okay, Discourse Historical Approach by Vodak and Reisegil. So the Discourse Historical Approach basically links field of action, genres, discourses, and texts, and mainly, at least with Vodak and Reisegil, they use it in the political context. They used it, like what Ma'am Ched said, in policy making context. So what the the good thing about a discourse historical approach is that it is basing its analysis on a diversity of cases. For example, if you are dealing with policy, then you would have to deal with how policy is made, and this goes to your the political field. So, in depending on how policies are made in a particular country, for example, your politicians would have to debate on certain policies. They would have to introduce certain bills, for example. They use the language of the legal language to introduce certain bills. But then in their debates, they would use common language, for example. They would talk to the media to introduce their proposed bill. There would be an explanation of sorts. They would probably produce certain paraphernalia to advance their agenda. So all these things would have to be covered in a discourse historical approach. So different genres of texts and discourses would have to be covered in a discourse historical approach. The main issue here is that it tends to be quite taxing because you'd have to gather a lot of different data sets at different levels of policy formation, for instance. That is why in doing a discourse historical approach, you usually do it as a team. You cannot substantially do it as an individual researcher because it is impossible for one researcher to gather all the different genres of text in a particular discursive setting and analyze them and come up with a sound analysis. You'd have to be in a team. Usually it is done in a team. So that is the discourse historical approach. It is discursive. It is discourse because it is discursive. It is historical because you'd have to follow how the developments of in the creation of a particular policy, for instance. So you'd have to follow that particular construction up from the beginning to the end. And you'd have to, like, for each particular period in that creation of a particular policy, you'd have to show the different genres of discursive situations or texts that compose the different stages of the policymaking process. So you could imagine how taxing that would be. The second approach is a corpus linguistics approach, and this is mostly attached to Motner. And this is the critical discourse analysis tends to be qualitative in its approach, generally, because it is interpretive work. You'd have to do a lot of interpretation. That's why one of its philosophical foundation would be hermeneutic, right? So it is all about interpretation. It is all about making sense of certain, cases. But there is also a quantitative side to it because you would have to show patterns of practices. It's not necessarily quantitative, but you'd have to do some counting, like frequencies. But Motner's approach, a corpus linguistics approach, is largely quantitative. It is mainly linguistic based. It is reliant on certain applications or software to help you analyze a large set of data. So by its name, corpus, it requires you to have a large body of data for you to be able to establish certain arguments. Linguistic based because the software that you will be using would mainly tackle certain linguistic components, like the frequency of certain vocabulary or certain words, collocation of certain words. So these things, and especially if you're applying it to a large body of data, you could only do it when you use when you are computer aided, when you are machine aided. So it is impossible for one to do corpus linguistics without the aid of the machine. So, and that is the quantitative aspect of critical discourse analysis. The other approach is social actors approach, and this is one of the approaches developed by Van Lathan. He's actually developed other approaches, but more in the area of multimodal critical discourse analysis. But the social actors approach is one of the earlier approaches that he developed, and it is mainly about the sociological and linguistic aspects, or the confluence of sociology and linguistics in representing certain actors in a particular field of discursive practice. So social actors approach is, again, qualitative mainly, but it is complicated because Van Leeuwen created a model, a framework based on the English language that would capture how certain actors, or certain how people or individuals are represented or constructed in speech and writing. So it is not based on grammar, but it is founded on the principles of grammar. So, for example, why certain actors would be passivized or activized in a particular text, why certain actors, or how certain actors are objectified, how certain actors are constructed via the use of metaphors or objects, how certain practices of actors are legitimated by certain legitimizing devices. So SAA by Van Leeuwen is based on this particular diagram that he outlined. So if you are interested about it, I could give you the sources for it, the references for it. Okay. The next one is dispositive analysis, and this is more attached to Jaeger and Meyer. So this is the closest to a Foucauldian analysis amongst all the other critical discourse analysis approaches, because this is based on the notion of the dispositive or apparatuses. So meaning it is global or structuralist in view, because you will have to explain how structures like knowledge and power, like what we like how I introduced this particular lecture, quoting Foucault. So it is about knowledge and power, and how structures form our understanding of certain things, but those kinds of structures are deployed or channeled via different apparatuses, and that is the notion of the dispositive. So discourse and reality are two separate things, and the entity that connects them would be the person trying to make sense of his or her situation in between reality and the discursive formations that he or she creates and consumes. Okay, so that is dispositive analysis. Sociocognitive approach by Van Dyke or Van Dyck. It is more socio-psychological in its underpinnings. So mainly it relies on sociocognitive theory, and the point of sociocognitive approach is to be more attuned to the complexity of the notion of context. So to Van Dyck, for example, context is not objectively defined. While there is, a context that is separate from the individuals trying to make sense of the context, the only aspect of context that becomes important in a discursive situation is how the members of that, or how the participants in that particular discursive situation see or think about the context. So, for example, if you say that gender is one of the components of a particular context in a discursive situation, gender, as objectively defined, is not the actual context. To Van Dyck, the context is how each of the participants in the discursive situation would actually sociocognitively understand or apprehend gender. So that would be, the whole basis of context, at least according to this approach by Van Dyck. Okay. And the third one is by Fairclough, the dialectical relational approach. And similar to what we've been saying, since the beginning, Fairclough in this particular approach argues that all aspects of our experiences in the world would have a semiotic component to it. Okay, and the semiotic component is what critical discourse analysis should be about. Okay, and the point of critical discourse analysis is to unearth or to surface the social problems in the world and try to look for the semiotic aspect of those social problems and create propositions to resolve those social problems by attacking the semiotic aspect of those social problems. So that's, in a way, it's a more positive kind of critical discourse analysis, because it's not just about, the notion of critique. It is about critique, but it is just one aspect of Fairclough's dialectical relational approach. The other aspect is to propose certain ways to resolve the problems by focusing on the semiotic aspect of those problems. So these are some of the approaches to CDA. Again, if we'd like to talk about it in detail, I am not an expert of all these things. If to be transparent about it, I gravitate towards SAA by Van Leuven and dispositive analysis and the dialectical relational approach of Fairclough. So these are the three approaches that I'm more familiar with, because these are the approaches that I have used before, and I think that is sensible, that makes sense to me. This is not to say that all the others don't make sense to me. It's just that I haven't used them because as when I do my research, the objectives more commonly, my objectives could be tackled by the three approaches that I mentioned that I'm more familiar with. Okay. So any questions so far before we go to Norman Fairclough's basic model?
Question
or comment?
So, ako na lang, pasensya ka na. Kasi
Go.
bihira ka
Okay.
nakakarinig ng lecture. So, kunyari, policy, kasi meron din kasing idea that policy is not just the text or, the written text, but it's also the implementation. So, how it is perceived by the teacher, how they apply it. So, CDA pa rin. You can still do CDA beyond the written text.
Yeah, certainly. And I think, you know what, and this is not, maybe I wasn't able to say it. I think the best way of doing CDA is actually to be ethnographic about it. So if you are talking about policy, of course you will tackle, the written policy because that is the basis of the policy. But the implementation of it should be studied ethnographically, meaning you should observe, you should talk, to those who are, part of the entire experience. And that is how you actually strengthen your critical discourse analytic work. It's by being immersed in the embedment or the embeddedness of these particular discursive instances in its actual context of use or in its situation. So commonly, what I would suggest is, if you are doing critical discourse analysis, then you would have to actually allot a portion of your research to an ethnographic observation at the very least, where that particular case is, being experienced or being practiced. If you are, for example, analyzing media text, then you should, have a particular, you should allot ethnographic observation of how that media text is produced and consumed in a particular context. Similarly to policy, because policies tend to be cold when it is in its textual form, but it becomes it gains its actual life when it is implemented, when it's cascaded through different channels and interpreted differently by different players or participants in that particular situation. So that's how you see policy in action, actually. So and even in policy analysis, there is a discursive approach that would say written policy is different from on the ground policy. And these are all, but both of them are based on discourse. While one is based on the written discourse of the policy, the other one is based on how the actual exchange of ideas and information happen on the ground when a policy is being implemented. So, similarly, they are discursive situations and they could be tackled via CDA, except that you'd have to have an ethnographic knowledge about how the policy is implemented on the ground.
Okay, thank you. Especially that for discourse, kasama talaga yung ethnographic research.
Yeah.
At least
And
they go together.
Yes. And I recognize that it's not easy to do because an actual kind of ethnographic research would entail a lot of resources for the students. But kaya ang sa akin, at least do ethnographic observation. If you cannot immerse in the community, for example, or in the context that you are studying, at least spend some time with them and observe how they how they practice certain things and talk to them. And that is how you create more convincing arguments in your critical discourse analysis. Okay. So, move on ako sa susunod na part. Matatapos na. I hope you have some time for the activity. So, this one is familiar. It's a familiar model. So, when we speak of the three-dimensional model of critical discourse analysis by Fairclough, alam na alam natin to malamang kung nag-critical discourse analysis reading tayo. But I decided to include this because whenever I read a project or a study that claims to be using the three-dimensional model of critical discourse analysis by Fairclough, I always, it is a common observation. It is a common, it's commonly, I commonly observe a particular, how do I say it? A missed opportunity in applying this particular model fully. And I will tell you what that missed opportunity is that I commonly observe in studies that claim to have used this particular approach. So Fairclough's three-dimensional discourse model is quite elegant. It's fairly simple. It just says that discourse or any kind of discursive sample or case or situation would have to be seen through these three dimensions. One, discourse as text, and this is the middle one. The first thing that we'd have to do is to see the textuality of the case. And because Fairclough in the early 90s developed this particular model, and critical discourse analysis during that time was more focused on the linguistic aspect of discourse. It is understandable how this particular model is actually heavily linguistic based. So it's based on verbal language. It's based on words and grammar and written or spoken text. So when we say discourse as text, we are concerned about the actual linguistic or stylistic devices used in forming that particular text. So vocabulary or individual words, grammar or how words are combined in clauses into sentences, how these sentences are linked via cohesion, and how certain linked sentences would form an entire text structure that is unique in its particular use. So when we claim to do critical discourse analysis, then we would have to be exacting about how we describe the particular text, and we'd have to really dissect the text in its basic components, from the words to the grammar to the cohesion to the text structure, because an essay is different from a news article, right? Even if both of them are composed of words mainly, an essay would have a different way of relaying its information or message via the grammar and cohesion and its text structure compared to a news article. So we'd have to be sensitive to the differences and the linguistic choices that we make when we try to construct or when texts are constructed or produced or consumed. Okay, so that is the first level or the first dimension of Fairclough's model. The next one is discursive practice. This is the orange one. And this is all about the production and consumption of texts. That is why it is called discursive practice or discourse practice, or discourse as a practice, activity or engagement. So when we speak about production and consumption of text, we are talking about the members' resources, our interpretive and expressive resources, the limits and potential of our vocabulary, for example, the limits and potential of our training or beliefs, for example, about which forms of writing would more effectively convey our, agenda or message. And the members' resources for expression and interpretation, it's coupled with the specific nature of the social practice in the production and consumption context. Um, a social media post would have a different production and consumption context compared to a broadcast news text, right? So even if both of them would convey information, would convey certain ideas, they belong to a different way of doing uh, the construction and dissemination and distribution of ideas. So we'd have to take that into consideration. So in the beginning, we are concerned about the text and its components. The second level is concerned about how these texts are produced and consumed in a particular kind of long-standing practice. So how are news articles produced versus how are social media posts produced? How is broadcast news produced versus how is information produced by vloggers claiming to be citizen journalists? So all these things would have their own political economic entanglements, and that would have to be taken into consideration if you are doing critical discourse analysis. And how do you actually access that particular information um, more effectively? Again, it's by ethnographic observation. You'd have to know how certain texts are produced and consumed in that particular context. Commonly, you do it by going into that context and seeing how it is produced, observing and talking to people. Of course, you could do that by literature review if certain processes are fairly established. That could help you to some extent, but seeing how texts are produced and consumed in its particular context and in its actual context of practice will give you a different insight, because the lit review is secondhand information. It's a report from someone else who has observed that particular kind of practice. But as a critical research analyst, it is important for you to observe it yourself so that you would actually produce your own insights about how texts are produced and consumed in a particular manner. So that is the second level. The third dimension is the socio-cultural practice. And we should always remember that this third level is all about, the grand theories that we have. Critical discourse analysis is interpretive work. And the strength of our interpretation is usually reliant on how deeply embedded or immersed we are in theory. So this is where theory would play a big part in the third dimension. This is where the notions of ideology, hegemony, for example, or power would be most useful, because this is the way you explain why certain practices are done in a particular way in the production and consumption of certain texts. For example, why social media is more more dominant currently than legacy media in terms of information or news dissemination. So there would have to be, a political economic explanation to it. And that political economic explanation is all about the notion of, global structures of power and hegemony in society. And because certain things are produced in this particular way, we observe, that, texts that come from these particular ways of doing things would tend to have a particular characteristic, right? So a news article in legacy media would be worded differently compared to a news report from your, friendly neighborhood vlogger, for example. They would tend to use words differently because they are, they have different contexts of production and consumption. And these differences in the context of production and consumption is, contained, is, under particular larger structures of power in society. And I'm not just talking about economic power. We are talking here about political power. We are talking here about, even, our notions of education, religion in the Philippines, for example. So all these big institutions would have its effect on the way we produce and consume certain texts. Okay? So these are the three dimensions of discourse as outlined by Fairclough. Okay. But my only reminder is when you use it, be sure that you tackle all the three dimensions. Because most of the time, and this is what I was talking about, most of the time, students would actually just focus on the first dimension, describing, the text, and then jump to the third dimension. What does it mean, theoretically? More commonly, research or those who claim to use this model would tend to miss the second dimension, and that is the discursive practice dimension of the textual production and consumption. They tend to forget this because they are excited to interpret why certain texts use certain words in this particular manner, and they would like to theorize it all at once. Okay, what is missed is, actually a very important meso level of analysis, because if you think about it, the second level is the intervening dimension between the larger structures of power and the micro example of the text. So in order for a text to be produced and consumed in this larger context, of power, there would have to be production and consumption practices at play or at work here, right? So never miss this particular, the second level. So you'd have to be able to explain um, why a text is produced in this particular way, why a text would have these particular features. And it is because of the production and consumption practices in this particular case, before jumping to the whole interpretation using the theories that you know. For example, you read particular news reports portraying or representing rape or abuse of women. Okay? And you probably would be able to say that certain words are commonly used in tabloids, for example, when reporting rape cases of women. Um, and then you jump to the conclusion, oh, because we live in a patriarchal society where women are denigrated in a particular way. So we are missing the point here. We are missing the point that there is a particular way of producing and consuming news via the tabloid versus other sources of news. So you'd have to establish that first before you jump to the larger global analysis or more theoretical analysis. I hope I'm making sense, because all these things tend to be abstract, especially if we are running out of time. Okay, as an example, okay, and I know that this is an old example, but I think this is still kind of significant, and but also the personality featured here is still we still see him. national media. Okay, so in this particular example, I will present to you three excerpts from news reports. Okay, via social media, via online media. I mean, so again, the three dimensions of the Faircloughian model would be the text, the discourse practice, and the social cultural practice. I am not, intending for us to analyze these this set of data in detail. I would just like you to feel how the three dimensions should work together. So, for example, in this particular excerpt, Palace says Filipinos should be ashamed as PH tops with most COVID-19 cases in Southeast Asia. So, and they actually quote Roque saying, ang dami pong pasaway sa atin at dahil po dyan, number one na naman po tayo sa ASEAN sa dami ng COVID-19. Nakakahiya po yan. Roque said in a virtual press briefing. Okay? So, be sensitive to the text, the word choices, for example, how certain, lexical or vocabulary is used here. What is a kind of a prominent word that's being used here. Okay. Plus, of course, remember in discourse practice, this is news. Okay, this is online news, so they would have to report certain things in a certain way. And social cultural practice, we would be able to establish that much later because we need more evidence for the kinds of argument that we are making. Like I said, a while ago, critical discourse analysis would have to be based on a set of data and not just one token. Okay. Next sample. Okay. Again, from a different news site, Roque was quoted as saying, itigil nyo na yung pagiging pasaway, manatili kayo sa inyong tahanan, mahiya naman kayo, hindi na natin i-deny dahil dapat tayo mga Pilipino mahiya dahil nagpapakita tayo ng walang disiplina. Again, certain words were used, okay, commonly. We are trying here to establish a particular pattern of linguistic choice. Okay? And the third, sample is Filipinos not inherently pasaway, Palas. The Philippines now has more than 70,000 confirmed cases of coronavirus disease 2019, the second in Southeast Asia after Indonesia, which has nearly 90,000. Emphasizing a certain point, officials have blamed violators of quarantine measures for the spike in the infection and have vowed to intensify the implementation of localized lockdowns, testing, and contact tracing efforts. I inherently believe they're Filipinos, not pasaway or violators. Presidential spokesman Harry Roque told CNN Philippines. Okay, so if, for example, this is the set of data that we have, okay, what if, my first question is, what, linguistic characteristics could you observe in these three, samples in our data set? Would anyone like to, try to answer that? What, linguistic characteristics would you observe if we are dwelling on the text as the first dimension? Anyone?
One class, anyone?
Quiet ba talaga yung mga students mo?
Oo nga, minsan.
Or gabi na kasi? Sorry, I will just cut short my lecture. I won't go over time. Don't worry about it. Kaya lang, answer the question para matapos tayo. So what class? What observation could you use? Linguistically, ano yung features dito na it's actually very obvious, right? It's kind of obvious, the words being used by Roque. Ano yung common?
Ako muna. Ano ba? Dahil, yung pasaway, Tagalog?
Yeah, di ba? So there is the the dominance of that word pasaway, right? So, but for example, we latch on to that. So we say that the word pasaway has been used by this particular official in this particular situation, and culturally, pasaway has a particular resonance, right? So as Filipinos, we would understand why pasaway is significant in this particular discourse context, and why pasaway is something that is not easily ignored. We should not easily ignore, because pasaway has a moral judgment also, right? And in this particular situation during the COVID-19 pandemic, um, certain things were done by the government in a particular way to control the population. And the use of the word pasaway is a form of control, for example. But so maybe that is one of the textual features of the data set. But in terms of discourse practice, we should not forget that these are news reports. And as news reports, specifically online news reports, they have a particular way of doing things, right? Compared to when, for example, you hear this particular quote from from Roque being discussed in social media posts, right? So they would have to be they would while they are discussing the same things, like Roque's use of pasaway, or Roque blaming the Filipino people for the spread of the COVID-19 virus. A blog post, or a discussion post online would have a different discursive practice than the online news reports, and you'd have to be sensitive to the differences in that kind of production and consumption context before you say, for example, that um, socioculturally, the word pasaway here becomes significant because it is a way for the government to control to cast the blame of its incompetence in handling the COVID-19 pandemic, to cast the blame on the people themselves because they are not following the rules. So from a Foucauldian perspective, it is a way of controlling the population. So before you go to that particular kind of more theoretical analysis, establish first the discursive practices in online news reports. And certainly, on these online news reports would highlight certain things, right? And Roca's use of the word pasaway is newsworthy in terms of the news bites. So my point is, when we try to analyze certain things, always include the three dimensions and don't jump from the first dimension to the last dimension.
Yeah.
Yes,
Alvin,
Ma'am
ano ba siya yung significant ba na yung palace, yung Malacanang palace na sa likod niya, yung picture niya na yun?
Yeah, if we
Part of
are
the
going to be
discursive practice,
multimodal
ganyan.
about it, yeah. But also, Ma'am Chad, you'd have to consider that this is a common practice kasi when the spokesperson of the palace would have an official press briefing, the palace, that particular picture would have to is always in the background. And this is not to say that that is not significant, but it's just to say that in terms of discursive practice, it's always been the case. And it has a particular meaning why official press briefings would have to be done in this particular way. Okay? So, yun, just a reminder that, for us to be able to deploy Fairclough's model effectively, always include the three dimensions. Don't miss out on the second dimension, because that's what I observe in many of the discourse, analysis studies that I've read. They always actually ignore the second dimension, and that's a discursive practice. So describe the text, but also describe the production and consumption practice in online news reports, because that is different from, for example, blogging or legacy media news reports. Okay. So I will move on to the next section because I don't want to, go over time. So in the many years of after 2 decades of actually the CDA practice in 2000, there was a critical assessment of CDA, and I like to mention that because this is also my way of saying that critical discourse studies as a field is continuously changing and evolving. Okay, so Blomert and Bulkin reviewed the many critical discourse analysis projects over in after 2 decades of it being introduced, and they actually argue that there are limits. There are limits to doing in there are limitations to the way that critical discourse analysis had been done. From the time of its inception up to 2000, in particular. One is there is a weak tackling context. Okay, and context is, that's why I began with context. Always contextualize your critical discourse analysis so we don't make the same mistakes again. And a good way of doing that, like I said, is an ethnographic consideration of the context. So in Fairclough's model, it is the second dimension. Go to the always investigate the ethnographic aspect of the discursive situation, because this is where we will understand the meaning-making resources of all the participants in that particular discursive instance or situation. Number two, there is a linguistic limit to the way that CDA had been done, at least before. And the recommendation is to include both linguistic and non-linguistic components. That is why we turn multimodal, so that we are more holistic in our semiotic approach. Okay? So we do not only analyze words now, certainly we analyze all types of semiotic resources. And number three is they are advocating for a participatory agenda, so that critical discourse analysis won't just be about critique, but would actually try to entice the community that they are trying to do a research on, and encourage them to be more critical about their engagement with discourse, any kind of discourse in their everyday lives. So resistance and activist linguistics is more the agenda right now. If we are to fulfill the goal of critical discourse studies, that is emancipation society, then we'd have to be inclusive of the community that we are trying to do a research on. Okay, so these are, overall the kinds of advancements that we are trying to do in critical discourse studies. And the question right now is, why CDA or CDI, CDS, or small letter CDA? CDI is critical discourse interpretation. Alan Bell, for instance, suggested that instead of CDA or CDS, why not use the label critical discourse interpretation? Because what we do is actually interpretive work. So these are, the options for the labels. But the point is not to choose one particular label for the practice, but the thinking of the renaming of the practice is an indicator of the development in the practice, is an indicator of how the practice is currently developing in many different directions. And some of them are, mentioned by, are actually a reaction to the criticism by Blomer and Bolkestein. So one direction is to be more multimodal about it. Another direction is to be more positive about it. They call it positive discourse analysis. So instead of just being limited to critique, then you'd have to propose ways to resolve the problem. And this is the dialectical relational approach of Fairclough, another model developed by Fairclough. So whether it's critical discourse analysis, critical discourse interpretation, critical discourse studies, or small letter CDA, the point is CDA is currently evolving, and it's an exciting field because it never stops, developing in all sorts of directions. Okay. So from CDA to CDS now, like I mentioned, we are doing these things. We revisit and integrate foundational theories like post-structuralism, the notion of habitus by Bourdieu, recontextualization by I forgot the theorist, but the notion of recontextualization. So Bernstein. So and also, like I said, more positive discourse analysis and reconfiguring multimodality in our critical discourse analytic project. So currently, these are some of the developments in critical discourse studies. And again, I apologize for not being able to go into the detail, but we could talk more about it tonight or in another occasion. That's the end of the lecture for tonight, at least. If you have any questions, Dale, or comments.
Thank you very much, Sir Alvin. Dami na naman natutunan. It's nice to listen to the lecture kaysa binabasa ko lang before, So now, class, let's ask, you can now ask questions, especially related sa gagawin yung research, because, as Sir Alvin said, that CDA is part of ethnographic research, Pwede siyang tawaging methodology, at the same time theory din. Okay, so Marie, Marie has the first. Sige, Marie, go ahead.
Ay, hello, sir. So, actually, nag-gets ko po yung a major part of the lecture, and ang inisip ko kasi is because of my broadcom background. So, mas na-apply ko rin siya sa pag-interpret and pag-critique ng news. So,
Yeah.
if gusto ko lang din po, I guess, to clarify din po kung tama yung understanding ko. So, with CDA, so the first level will be breaking down, I guess, the text as text. So, the
Marie,
artifact.
but this is just for Fairclough's model, ha?
Oh, yes po, sir. So,
Yeah,
yung
specifically Fairclough. Yeah.
yun po. So, yung breaking down ng text, that could be the first dimension. And then
And
the
it's
second,
first, yeah, the first one, yeah.
so the second dimension is the discourse or the medium. Kung tama
The
po yung
practice, yeah.
So, yeah, so the practice, and then you apply the socio-cultural context. So
Only after you have,
only after
integrated only after you have understood and explained or described how the practice is being done in this particular situation. Yeah.
So parang linear po yung approach na first,
No, actually hindi. So yeah, it's a good thing that you are asking this, Marie. So it's not really linear. It's just that commonly you start with the text because you would have to describe the text, right? And also after describing the text, then you would have your question now is why is the text produced this way? So the next level is probably to see because production and consumption in this particular context is done in this way. Parang logically ganun yung talon mo. But actually, hindi siya context because after you have described the first two dimensions, the third dimension is only fulfilled by going back and forth the first two dimensions. Parang pabalik-balik ka na. So I don't know if you can imagine it. The way for you to explain the third dimension is for you to go back and forth the second level and the first level, or the second dimension and the first dimension. Because you won't be able to explain it when you do it in a linear fashion. May recursivity eh. So after the description of the first and second level, the third level is all about interpreting the first level, the interaction of the first level and the second level. And it's a back and forth process. Hindi siya talaga linear na after step 1, step 2, then step 3. Hindi siya ganun nangyayari in the actual interpretive process.
Okay po, sir. Thank you po for that
Marie.
clarification.
So if you are familiar with the hermeneutic interaction, what do you call it? The hermeneutic circle, for example. Parang going back and forth, you have a micro text and a large global situation. Then you go back and forth the interpretation. Hindi kasi nangyayari talaga na after the first level, tapos na yon, then second level ka na. And the actual analysis, then you would have to do a lot of back and forth in that particular, attempt at analyzing or examining.
Okay po, thank you, sir. Mas malinaw nga po siya kasi in doing research pa, balik-balik naman po talaga
yes,
tayo.
Yes, exactly. Ganun talaga siya. So, it's just that, ang ano nga dyan, some would actually say that the three-dimensional model of Fairclough actually implies that when you are at the second level, the first and second level is analysis, and the third level is actually interpretation. So I don't know if if you see analysis and interpretation that way, because analysis tends to be very technical, right? But interpretation is all about meaning making of the technical aspect. So after you describe the text and the discursive practice, then the next step is for you to interpret why these things happen in this particular way. So it's an interaction between analysis and interpretation. Kaya siya pabalik-balik.
Okay po, sir. So, thank you po. Pwede pong last question na lang.
Sure.
Would this approach, kasi po, syempre, malaking factor po yung linguistics aspect of it.
Well, yes, that's it.
Would this approach require us to have a really deep knowledge of linguistics?
If you have a deep knowledge of linguistics, that would certainly help. But if you don't, that is not an absolute hindrance. Because when I did my PhD, for example, my background was not linguistics actually, and you could learn the more fundamental linguistic or social linguistic, more sa akin more specifically social linguistic and critical linguistic concepts and tools. Hindi naman yun imposibleng matutunan eh. And but also because we are doing multimodal right now, I'd also like to remind everyone that it's not just the linguistic that you would have to tackle. You'd also have to tackle the multimodal aspect of it. So if you have a background in linguistics, that would help. But you should also it's also good for you to have a background, for example, in semiotics or a background in visual or oral language, something that you, Marie, would probably have because you're from your undergrad is broadcasting. You probably had courses in visual language or oral language, right? So, yun, malaking tulong din yun if you are doing a multimodal kind of analysis. But to answer your question, a linguistics background would help, but if you don't, then you could study it. Wala namang problema dun. Hindi yun hindrance talaga. You don't have to be afraid of it. Most students are afraid of the linguistic aspect of it, right? Kasi grammar, vocabulary, etc., etc. But you don't have to do all those things. You can do the more salient ones. For example, you have a data set, and you observe in the data set that the lexical choices or the word choices are actually the more salient ones. Then focus on the word choices. Wala namang problema doon. It's just that if you have a linguistic background, then you could go more deeply into the grammatical component of it. And that would, certainly help you in your description of the text.
Thank you po, sir. Okay na po ako. Salamat.
Thank you. Thank you, Marie. Thank you.
Sige, may tanong pa, no? Kunyari, Alwin, kunyari teacher, and then nagsalita siya, lalaki siya. May sinabi siya tungkol sa gender. And then sinabi niya in a pabiro, manner.
Yeah.
So masasabi mo na yung text, yung sinabi niya about gender. And then the discursive practice is
exactly
humor. O kaya gumamit siya ng Bible,
yes,
nagbukas siya ng Bible. So that's a discursive.
That's right. Yes,
okay,
yes.
Okay.
That's a discursive practice because usually also discursive practice has to do with genre. Yung the ways we do things, the common ways, the rules of doing things. So if you are using humor, that would have a different set of rules for using humor in a particular context. If you are more, biblical about it, then that has a particular, rule in terms of practice, not necessarily formal rule, but in terms of practice, you have, an established way, fairly established way of doing things. So in interpreting, you would have to consider that. Kasi the words might be the same when we use them. Like, for example, a teacher explaining gender. But if the teacher actually used humor as a genre versus a teacher using something more religious as a genre, then they would have to be interpreted differently. Kasi iba yung kanilang discursive practice that they relied on in that particular moment.
Great.
So, and that is why an ethnographic observation is important. Kasi kapag nasa lang yan, nasa papel lang, kung recording lang yan, then you don't have, all the information, right?
Kaya sa inyong paper, be mindful kung ano yung discursive practice, hindi lang pala yung actual na sinabi. Okay, great. That's very
and also
useful.
It's classroom setting. Iba pang discursive context.
Yeah, the classroom setting.
Yeah.
Yeah, tama, no? Tama, isa sa frame namin sa schooling is social reproduction. So yun na yung socio-cultural context din niya, no? Yung power. Okay, class, meron pa bang kayong question that's related, especially related sa inyong gagawin na research?
Melvin just has a comment on the chat. Sabi niya, it's a good thing that there's semiotic intersection. Intersecting approach. Yeah, because that's what they do in visual communication. What does Melvin do? Anong background ni Melvin?
Teacher siya sa fine arts. So
perfect.
Sa fine arts,
good,
Melvin.
That's cool.
So yung visual is also isa ring discursive yung visual.
Yeah. Especially if you are labeling it as art. Kasi magiging iba interpretation doon. If you're labeling it as art versus, labeling it as, popular media, for example, magkaiba yun, diba? So iba kaagad yung context of practice natin.
Okay. Kaya if we are observing a class for our research, so yun yung titignan namin. It's a classroom context.
Yeah.
Ano yung ginamit niyang means of communication.
Yeah.
Text, pwede rin gumamit pa siya ng English, di ba, power
Exactly.
language or
code choice.
Tagalog.
Exactly.
Mga ganyan. Ano? So yun yung
marami. So if you're doing CDA, just be prepared to do a lot of things. Kasi the thing with CDA, it's trying to be very aware of the specificities of the text and the context. Kaya ang dami-dami mong iintindihin. Iba pa yung issue ng, at the end of it all, you would have to do a theoretical explanation or interpretation of everything. So it's not an easy thing to do, actually. But it's fulfilling if you do it properly. And also, again, going back to my earlier slide, if you are committed to the same political and philosophical commitment that undergirds CDA. Kasi ang hirap naman gawin yan kung hindi ka naman din talaga politically committed if your political stance is different.
Kasi napakapayat naman kung puro thematic analysis.
Yes,
Okay, class, one more question kasi it's overtime na tayo.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, sorry din na ako maraming tanong. Any burning question? Wala naman. So, if you have question, tanungin ko na lang sa'yo. Anyway,
yes, and if you need references for some of the things, I could provide the ones that I have.
Yeah.
Especially if you're interested in multimodal analysis, because that's mainly what I do. So if Melvin here is interested in doing a multimodal kind of stuff, and also Marie. So I will have references for multimodal analysis because that's mainly my thing.
Yeah, and also yung binanggit mo na marami palang study CDA na classroom.
Yes, ang dami-dami talaga. One of the most favorite yan education setting, CDA.
So it's usually the teacher or pati rin yung students, di ba?
Pati students and materials, basically.
Okay. So those three items.
The three.
Okay, sige. So with that, we're very, 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 very thankful.
Thank you
to Dr. Aguirre for allowing us, yung giving us time to talk about these things. Mahirap tayo makarinig ng ganito, even our research class, when they talk about analyzing yung mga interview texts, simple lang, thematic analysis. But here we came to know a more elegant way.
But also, Ma'am Ched, thematic analysis could be a powerful approach. It really depends on the kind of thematic analysis that you're doing. It's just that if you're doing CDA, then you are more focused on, the specific components of the text or the thing that you're studying. Yung thematic analysis kasi wala namang ganong klaseng focus eh. But in CDA, you're encouraged actually to focus on the description of the text. Yeah.
That's right. So it will strengthen, they would strengthen each other.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I hope that later on you can also, you can give a talk on a more specific, like classroom interaction.
Yeah. Mas research-based na concrete kasi right now it tends to be abstract because this is introductory.
Yeah.
But so many things to talk about in CBA actually.
Okay. Baka later on, baka in a research class,
Yeah.
Sige. So, any siguro takeaway class? Any one or two of you can share their takeaway. Yeah. Magsalita naman kayo para naman hindi lang boses ko.
Yes, Marie, dalaw ka sa department.
So can I ask Melvin maybe, and who else can share their takeaway? Moimin or Ramil or anyone?
Hello. Marinig po ako?
Yeah, can hear you.
Ayan, hello. Thank you, sir, for the very intensive nga yung CDA introduction. Medyo na-overwhelm ako nung umpisa. Pero nakuha ko yung very interesting parang methodology in research. Also yung intersects nga nung visual communication in regards to yung sa CDA And yung roots kay Saussure din, I guess, no? Kasi linguist si Saussure. And at the same time, father of semiotics. Doon kami sa visual napunta, yung Viscom. So, ayun. And actually, meron akong nagtitesis ngayon na student na undergrad. Ang ano niya is words, no? Yung meaning of words, parang ganun. And then trying to contextualize it, yung Filipino words, no? And gagawa niya ng how the meaning of the words would relate to history.
Okay.
No? So, parang ganun. No, parang bakit ano ang ginagamit ng mga Katipunero at the time, and then how that would be used to gain interest in history as a subject. Parang ganun yung gist. So, ayun. Well, na-share
Pero
ko
ikaw,
lang.
Melvin, what do you do actually? What's your research interest?
For now, I'm in EdTech, actually.
Okay.
Educational technology. Hindi pa ako, wala pa akong actual na pero I'm very interested in CDA at this point kasi nakita ko andito yung semiotics eh. So it could have something to do with
I think,
yung
Melvin, you'd be actually more interested in a particular strand of CBA called multimodal critical discourse analysis, because its premises on the notion of design and how design is all about incorporating not just choices for the semiotic resources that you use, but that these choices are politically embedded. So mas ganon siya. That is, I think that particular approach would be more, parang interesting to you kasi yung ginagawa mo edtech and producing, educational apparatus is multimodal. Hindi lang naman linguistic talaga yan. Yeah. So, yeah, that one. I could send you articles on that, and if you are interested, because they have very, they are varying approaches, but they actually have very interesting propositions. Especially sa akin, yung pinaka-salient is the notion of design, because it's all about design if you think about it. In fine arts, for example, even that whole idea of design thinking, but design is actually, kind of motivated by choice, and choices are ideological if you go the CDA route.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Ayan, Melvin, pag nag-dissertation to our thesis. Right, Sir Alvin. Sige, so thank you very much. So it's 8:20, so we'll email you, and we would appreciate, kung may mga articles that we can use, especially in doing classroom observation. And then we'll have another meeting.
You could just send them, Ma'am Chen, my email address. That's fine if they'd like to send me.
Okay, sige. I will do that. Isend ko sa GC namin. Okay? So, thank you again, Dr. Aguirre, and to everyone who came. Salamat sa mga nagtanong. Okay, so good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Ma'am Chen, for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you po.
Thank you po.
Thank you po. Paalam.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Paalam.